Hello everybody, my name is Nicola and I'm a lecturer at the University of Westminster specialising in policing, criminal justice, but miscarriage of justice more broadly. I just want to, you're probably going to see this and be like, what has this got to do with anything that you've spoken about today? But I want to bring it back to 2 points. Previously, my colleague Suzanne talked about how injustice and miscarriage of justice is not isolated to what we've seen today in regards to Lucy Letby. Injustice, at the best of times, is cancerous in terms of that it is throughout our justice system and it comes in all shapes and forms. And secondly, following on from the speakers that we had previously, my research highlights that the role of families, and specifically the role of mothers, is incredibly important within justice. And we cannot answer any questions in relation to what justice is if we don't have those voices present. My research specifically focuses on an area of law called joint enterprise. I'm not going to talk about it too deeply, but I do want to raise this issue that the concept of miscarriage of justice it doesn't have a fixed definition, and depending on who you ask and in what context, the understanding of miscarriage of justice is going to be very different. For a long while, it exists on a horizontal axis. So it talks about the wrongfully accused, unsafe convictions, unfair convictions. It was the notion of factual innocence, also extending to procedural innocence. Beyond that, now we see the idea of miscarriage of justice existing on a vertical axis. And that also means the failure to convict. And we see that in the context of Stephen Lawrence, where his racist murderers were not convicted at the time. And we also see it under the banner of Labour's tough on crime years. My research also focuses on stretching out the idea of injustice, and it's stretching it out to a structural lens. And that means that in certain instances, there is law that is law. And unfortunately, how these laws play out in the courtroom means that injustices occur. And that is specifically in the context of joint enterprise law. Now, like I said, joint enterprise, is a form of secondary liability. All you need to understand in regards to joint enterprise law is that if all of us in this room right now decided to go and riot to Marks and Spencer's, right, and you all follow me, and in the process of that riot, I kill someone, there is a possibility that you all will be convicted of murder because you either knew or ought to have known what my intention to kill was. That is what joint enterprise is, okay? Essentially, it's legitimate on paper, it is a legal doctrine, but its application in the court is socially and morally questionable. There's various courtroom tactics that's used, a lot of them which was talked about today. A big one being experts, specifically experts on the gang, is used. But what I've realised, or what I've found, based from talking specifically to mothers of young people that have been convicted under joint enterprise, is that injustice is unmet expectations. That is what it is. And it manifests most clearly through the raising and dashing of hope as we navigate the criminal justice system. And I want to just talk a little bit about that injustice journey that I explored with my mothers. Essentially, at that initial trial stage, they weren't really that bothered. They were concerned to a degree, but they talked about it in very fanciful ways. They referred to PC Plunker arresting their son and being like, I was worried to a degree, but I wasn't too worried because I knew he didn't kill anybody. I knew he wasn't going to be convicted. And the reason they didn't have any worry is because they believed in this idea of British justice. They had a belief that the system, the court system, was there to seek out truth. And they honestly believed that everything was going to be fine. This hope was high. And then when the guilty verdict came, we seen that hope dashed. One woman talked about how it felt like her uterus was being squeezed whenever her child was taken away from her because of murder. we see that hope rise again with the appeal process. Because I'm not sure, one of the speakers today talked about James Reason and the Swiss cheese model. And the idea that each of these areas are meant to be a process, a level, which stops failures from happening. So they fell through the try process. They were like, it's okay, we've got the appeals. The appeals is going to be fine. Because the appeal is made up of judges that will see reason. They will get it. They're not as biased as the jury. They're not going to be as the mothers said, they're not going to be as idiotic to believe the prosecution tactics, to believe the narratives that's put forward. And we see this hope rise. But as we've heard today, the inertia and the silence that we received from the appeal court meant that that hope dashed. But wait, because you've got the CCRC, Nick, right? Excellent institution, right? Excellent institution. Because the institution, if you fail once, how many times can you go back? 1, 2, 3, unlimited. So these mothers, again, had this expectation, eventually, they'll be heard. They go to the CCRC, they apply, and that hope is dashed once again. Then we had Jogi. Jogi was a very specific UK Supreme Court case that tried to address the injustice of joint enterprise law. And this was one of the most difficult points of hope, right? Because by this stage, we're starting to experience a sense of hopelessness. And then hope comes back in with a Supreme Court case. And whenever I spoke to, I was very lucky enough that I got to travel to some prisons alongside the mothers to go visit their sons. And one son was like, oh man, don't talk to me about Joji. Don't talk to me. He was like, the day I heard that the judgment came back positive, as in we're going to change the law, he was like, I was packing my bags. I was packing my bags. In my head, I was like, right, my shoes is going to that person, my junk is going to that person, because I was going home. Because this justice system, it's finally doing what it was meant to do. It was finally meeting our expectations. It was finally delivering justice. And then we had to go back to the CCRC, right? And we realized that everything that we fought for, this massive change in the law, it didn't work. And we've seen our hope being dashed again. This is going to come across as very theoretical, so bear with me. Through the raising and dashing of hope, I rely on an academic called Lauren Barland. And she talks about cruel optimism, that in a lot of situations, the hope that we cling on to has a duality. One, it keeps us flowing, but it's the clinging to that hope that causes the most pain. Because of those expectations that the justice system will deliver for us. And that raising and dashing, the raising keeps us up there, but the dashing breaks our hearts. And that's the reality of the justice system in the context of miscarriage of justice. The second area, which is relevant to a lot of what we've talked about today, is epistemic injustice. And it's the systematic dismissal, discrediting of certain voices. It essentially creates a hierarchy of knowledge. And in the context of my work, mothers were discredited. The mother's experience and understanding of injustice is, for the most part, within academic literature, lowered. Because they're not the voice of the lawyers, they're not the voice of the judiciary, they're not the voice of the Crown Prosecution Service, they're not policy makers, they're not experts. And the idea that they have to fight to have their voice heard, the idea that they had to fight to highlight that their expectations were not met, is injustice in and of itself. This leads me on to my final slide. So what is injustice? I'm not a big believer, but I am not capable of answering this. I'm not. But I think we need to start by reframing the debate. I think we need to open up the room a little bit bigger to assess what injustice is, because it's not just people that are wrongfully convicted in terms of factual innocence, that it comes in all different shapes and forms. And coming on from obviously the families that have spoken previously, this is the most important point, that true definitions of injustice must be co-produced with those impacted. That if they're not in the room and if their voice is not being heard, there's no point having a conversation. And that's me, Darren. Thank you very much.